being that one, reason for that being one, we have young, energetic people, very intelligent, very creative. Two, that we have the market, right? We have a very large population. Three, we actually have, they always say that necessity is the mother of innovation or invention. We have the needs, right? So we have the young people who are going to look for solutions to solve local problems around themselves and solve problems that are global, or the problems we solve here, we end up solving problems globally. What's now critical is that we create the enabling environment for this to happen, right? So we're basically pulling all these knowns together to create that environment for this exact thing to happen, right? So it was important that we address this through policy, and that's why, and through legislature. I think if you look at Mr. President's speech, New Year's speech from January 2021, he clearly stated everything I just stated. Young, creative people, we must find ways to support them through legislature. And that's exactly what this is. So this is basically actualization of that vision. And that's why we now have an act now today.
Okay, brilliant. Thanks a lot, Oswald. So let me turn over to you very quickly, David, and just also try to provide some background. The Startup Act has 48 sections, and those sections are divided into 10 parts. For many people, that's a lot. In light of your role as the lead of the Nigeria Startup Act Drafting Committee, can you provide us with a bird's eye view of the overall structure of the legislation so that our audience would have an appreciation of the structure of the legislation?
All right, thanks, Dr. Wale, and good morning, everyone. Glad to be here. I'll take you up on the first thing that you said about the many sections. Well, yes, 48 sections, I think it's reasonable. When you look at a couple of laws we have that exist in Nigeria, I mean, the Nigeria Communications Commissions Act has over 150 sections. An act that I'm sure that you're so familiar with, like the back of your hand, the Companies Income Tax Act has over 100 sections. Personal Income Tax Act has over 100 sections as well. And of course, CAMA has probably like close to, if not more than 800 sections. So when you juxtapose that with the Nigeria Startup Act, you would say that we have a soft read, like a small document. But the reason why it was broken into those different parts was because we wanted it to be very clear to people who read the bill now and act what those different breakdowns mean. For instance, if you look at part 1 of the act, it deals with objectives and applications. So we wanted that to also be very clear. We're also thinking about it being very accessible to the startups, the entrepreneurs, the businessmen who this act will directly impact on. If you look at the few acts, and I'm not saying that they're not well drafted, but we just wanted something that would be easy for you to just go to a particular part in the act. You say, okay, this part deals with this, and then you just go there, you look for what it's talking about, and then you come to understand it. So part 1, for instance, deals with the objectives and application of the act. Part 2 talks about the establishment of the National Council for Digital Innovation and Entrepreneurship. And that particular part was important for us. It probably has about 6 sections there. When we were even crafting this, we considered how can we have a body without setting up an agency of government, since we have maybe like close to 900 MDAs that exist in Nigeria. So we didn't want to set up a new agency, but we wanted something that would have legal personality and be able to sue and also drive policies. So the council was set up. A council agent was also set up under that part as well. So we dealt with that there. The membership of the council, who will be on the council, the private sector guys, the government guys, all of that is under part 2. When you now go to part 3, it then deals with some of the operational structures of the council. Again, probably has about 4 sections or thereabouts, talks about the secretariat that will be set up. There is a startup support and engagement portal where the MDAs that deal with startups, as well as the ecosystem players and the startups, will also form part of that startup support and engagement portal. So this is dealt with under Part 3. Part 4 then deals with the labeling process, which I'm sure we'll get into as we move along. Part 5 deals with the Startup Investment Seed Fund, which is a fund that is set up under the Act that will be seeded with a minimum of 10 billion naira, and from where the Secretariat can then fund startups that qualify for funding under the Act. And then the other Part 6 deals with training, capacity building, talent development, support and collaborations with academic research institutions. Part 7 deals with tax and fiscal incentives. Part 8 then deals with collaboration with the regulators. So there are a few regulators that we know on a periodic basis startups have to deal with. There's the Corporate Affairs Commission, there is the Intellectual Property Registries, the SEC, the Central Bank of Nigeria. So how will this act, intersect with those regulators and their own statutory functions? That Part 8 deals with that. Part 9 deals with accelerators and incubators, which are ecosystem players who support startups. And then Part 10 deals with clusters, hubs, innovation parks, technology development zones that would also be relevant, to the ecosystem. And then Part 11 deals with the miscellaneous provisions, the interpretation sections, data privacy and data protection and all that. So, and each part probably has, some may have maybe 4 or 5 sections, some may have 6 sections deliberately, so that anybody who picks it up can just go directly to those provisions that they want to look at. If you want to find out about the tax and fiscal incentives, you just go there straight, and it's clear rather than it being modeled up in different sections. So it was for the purpose of clarity and purpose of breakdown that those 48 sections were then, spread across the different parts within the Act.
Thank you, Davidson. Thanks a lot for your response. I like you had already mentioned, we would get to a number of the parts and sections that you talked about and discuss them in more detail later on during the course of this tax chat. Let me just say that there's a question and answer model. So for members of the audience, if you would like to ask any question, you can just drop your questions there. We would field the questions, to either Davidson or Oswald during the course of the tax chat, so that they can provide answers to those questions. One of the things, and Oswald, I'm going to turn over to you now, especially regarding the things you mentioned about the objectives of the Nigeria Startup Act. And there is a question about the Act. And now, as you are aware, there's already a policy, there's an existing policy by the National Information Technology Agency that deals with national digital innovation, entrepreneurship, and startup. And the question is, the policy was introduced around June 2021, and there are questions around how much impact that policy has made, and whether the impact of the legislation, the Nigeria Startup Act, would be any different from the policy that was already in existence. Because if the policy was in existence for about, say, 18 months, and maybe it had not had significant impact, why should people believe that the Nigeria Startup Act is going to be different? So I don't know if you could quickly answer that question, Oswald.
I would say people should do more than believe. People should do more than question if they should believe or not believe. I think what people should do is demand that this piece of legislature does exactly what it says it's going to do. Legislature is words on paper. What gives it life is people. It's people demanding and requesting and demanding that the laws be abided to. Right? So policy and a law are different things. Policy build-up can lead to a law, may lead to a law, or it could just be a policy that changes over time based on the circumstances. But a law is a law. Until amended, it's a law. So it's legislature. It's now a law which needs to be abided with. And what's critical there is that, one of the things we have to understand is that implementation is key. I think one of the questions is already coming is about, implementation being very important. Implementation, it takes time, but it can be expedited. But the actualization and the impact of the implementation may take a longer period of time, and it also takes participation of everybody to ensure that that's what happens, right? So we now have a law that speaks to a number of things. I mean, if anybody who reads the Nigerian Startup Act would see that there are a number of different areas that are touched, a number of seeds are planted, and those seeds will lead to policies. The organization, the structure in which the interaction between the private sector and the public sector is established in the law to ensure that that happens. So, earlier on, you asked me, why do we need a law? One of the key things I now tell people is that, when you do a startup, and a lot of times startup practitioners say, we want to disrupt, we're going to disrupt this market, we're going to disrupt this other market, we're going to disrupt how things are done, we're going to change how things are done. That is appreciated. That's 100% what we want. That's how we move the economy. That's how we make impact. That's how we add value. However, the policymaker is tasked with managing what exists now, with protecting what exists, protecting consumers, protecting the infrastructure. The policymaker draws the lines on the ground so that you know when you actually score a goal or when you haven't scored a goal, when you've now made a foul. It's the policymakers. The policymakers are like referees. Right? So when the policymaker sees disruption without understanding, what they see is displacement. And when you see displacement, you make a move to stop that displacement because it's causing a problem. So that's why it's important that the policymaker and the practitioner both sit down in the same table and co-create policies and regulations that enables innovation. We cannot compare ourselves to other climates. We can only look at them and take notes from them. We have to do what works for Nigeria in this given period. And what's critical is that both the policymakers and the practitioners collaborate and engage. So for instance, we now tell people, when you look at the Nigerian Startup Act, look at it from 5 distinctive perspectives, right? One of them being collaboration. The Act intends to push and drive collaboration through the council. The other one is engagement. The Act intends to drive engagement through the development of a consultative forum. I think Davidson just gave us a breakdown of the bill, so now you guys have an understanding what I'm pointing at in the Act. The consultative forum and the secretariat, where a lot of co-creation will happen, and the portal, what will be the medium in which it will happen on. Incentives, we have incentives to guide behavior and guide and drive investment of local funds, encourage entrepreneurs to take the risk of becoming entrepreneurs. Then we have linkages, which connects the private sector to the public sector, connects the private sector to key areas, or the other way around, which is more important because this is a service provider, connects key MDAs to this particular sector, right? So we've been asked the question, why tech-enabled? I've said more than once that it was intentional, right? Because this is the fastest growing sector globally, and Nigeria is uniquely positioned based on our demographic and a number of other reasons why I stated earlier, to take a lead in this sector. So it's important that we provide legislation to help this sector, enable this sector grow, right? So linkages brings the MDAs that are critical to this sector, and more MDAs will be added as new ideas are created to provide services and to create opportunity for partnerships and for growth. And the last one is supporting the supporters. Like you heard Davidson said, the last part of the act. We're talking about incubators, we're talking about hubs, we're talking about clusters, we're talking about free trade zones. And these are all initiatives to help drive the entities that support the ecosystem for growth. The Act is about growth. It's about ensuring that we're able to grow this sector, to ensure that we're able to have local investment in this sector, to ensure that we're able to move our startups, the number of them that are created. I mean, create, fail, jump back on it and recreate until you're successful. We look at countries like Tunisia, the first country to do a startup act, and their numbers, and they moved from about 40, 50 to about 800 startups today, and that's since 2018. And even Tunisia would tell you that with Nigeria, with the Startup Act, they are expecting quantum exponential growth. So I know the question is about implementation, but I just want to say that, what's critical is that we shouldn't leave it to others, right? We are all involved. Everybody in this ecosystem, everybody who's young, who is listening to this right now, is part and parcel to the success of the Nigerian Startup Act. It's not left to a few, it should be for the many.
Okay, thanks a lot, David. That was brilliant. I think just to summarize, Oswald is saying there needs to be the pull effect. The government can push legislation, the government can push policies, but at the end of the day, stakeholders need to pull and make demands on government to ensure that there is implementation, to ensure that the act actually achieves the objective it was set out, the objective set out in it. Okay, so Dave, Oswald, I will still ask you a quick question, that has also come up, and that is just to quickly clarify some seeming misunderstanding, that seems to be occurring, and that's in respect of the fact that many of the incentives in the Act talk about or are applicable to labeled startups or startups with labels. But the Act also uses the word startup in many places. And in some circles, there seems to be questions about whether it is all startups that can enjoy the benefits in the Act, or if it is only a segment of the startups in Nigeria that can enjoy it, specifically, for instance, other startups, maybe in the pharmaceutical industry, agricultural sector, the FMCG sector, aviation, shipping industry, are they also eligible to enjoy the benefits in the Act? Can they qualify as labeled startups, or is this just limited to startups that are involved in the digital technology ecosystem? So also, if you could clarify that point, I think that would be greatly appreciated.
So this Act is very, very specific. This Act is very, very intentional. This Act is very, very deliberate. And its focus is primarily tech-enabled startups, right? Tech-enabled startups, as a part of the SME class, if you want to look at it that way, there's a larger body of companies that are started, and ultimately, we are looking at a subset of them which are focused on delivering solutions through tech innovation, is what this Act is set up for. And having said that, this does not mean that other bodies cannot put together the same set of laws for the creative industry. And in fact, there is a bill being developed right now that is based on the process of the Nigerian Startup Act, which is the Big Tent approach, to expedite the process of putting a bill together for the creative industry in the same intentionality as the Nigerian Startup Act, which is focused on tech-enabled. I think globally, when you say startup, people tend to think, although the word definition can apply to any company, people tend to think tech-enabled startups or tech-enabled entities. But for clarity, we would say that no, this Act is specific and deliberate for tech-enabled innovation-based businesses. The idea of label, I know one of the things we also have to clarify is that what we tend to hear is people think it's a registration process. We're not particularly looking to register startups, but we do need to be able to label startups to understand who they are, right? To be able to monitor their progress based on the incentives that they're being provided in the Act. Also to make sure they qualify, because there's certain details on what qualifies you as a labeled startup within Nigeria, within the context of the Act. And another thing is also important to understand is that the Act does not limit its benefits or its impact to just labeled startups. The Act is looking to grow Nigerian businesses, right? We're going to give opportunities to our young people, well, our old people as well. I guess you can't count me as young. I'm looking, hopefully I can benefit from the Act myself. But ultimately, it impacts the entire ecosystem. So an example of this is that if we say we have incentives for incubators, hubs, and the like, nothing in the Act actually says that the hubs and the incubators can only service labeled startups. It says they can do what they do, continue to support the ecosystem. And there are ultimately a number of various benefits that are either direct benefits or secondary or tertiary benefits from the Act that would impact the entire ecosystem and all startups of all age groups. I mean, if we ultimately create a larger research behavior or pattern or activities in the country, it will affect all startups, it will affect all companies. If we're able to instigate computer education in university and maybe lower, it will create a larger pipeline of skills that be able to help even established economies like banks and the likes, right? So the impact of the act goes way beyond labels, right? So it's intentional, but its impact is exponential. So that's some of the things we need to think about when we read the act. It actually does waves, right? So there's waves that are going to add value to a number of areas.
Thanks a lot, Oswald. Thanks a lot. So I think that's clear now. The act is deliberate. There's a focus on companies that operate in the digital technology ecosystem. And for the audience, the provisions of Section 13 of the Nigeria Startup Act are very clear on the criteria for being eligible for labeling. One of the criteria is that the objects of the company must be innovation, development, production, improvement, and commercialization of a digital technology innovative product or process. So that's one of the criteria in Section 13 of the Act, and it's important to bear that in mind. But like Oswald has said, the ripple effect of the catalyzation of growth in the tech-enabled ecosystem is going to be massive, and it's going to positively, or it should positively affect other sectors of the Nigerian economy. Okay, so Davidson, I'm going to come to you now. And you and Oswald have touched on some of the advantages that labeled startups would enjoy. I would want you to maybe just expatiate on those advantages. What does a labeled startup stand to gain based on the Nigeria Startup Act?
All right, thank you. So I'll try and pick up from where Oswald left in the process. The advantages that they have, Tadib mentioned the investment seed fund earlier, right? Which is a fund that will apply to labeled startups, early stage guys, who are looking for funding and probably cannot attract most of these venture capitalists, who will be looking for folks who have scaled and who have traction. But because of the labeling process, it is like a sieving phase where the companies with the right metrics now come under the guidance and protection of the government, if you will. So that's one that they have. Another incentive is around obtaining pioneer status for those that qualify. Now, if you've looked at the pioneer status regulations and guidelines, they're a bit strict. The companies need to have minimum share capital of the 100 million naira. Then if you've ever processed a pioneer status application as well, it's a very cumbersome process that could probably take you a period of 9 to 12 months or more. What the Act seeks to do is to have a sort of special process, and that would require collaboration, of course, from the Secretariat now, collaborating with the Investment Protection Commission so that they can fast-track processes, expedite the approvals, and also provide certain services to the startups on a discount. There are also tax provisions there as well. Reference is made to the Industrial Development Income Tax Relief Act, where startups can have like a 5-year maximum period, having tax breaks. There are also provisions even for investors within the startups to have repatriation of their funds through the CBN window without all the bottlenecks and incentive for foreign investors, to come into Nigeria and invest and have a certainty around whatever exchange rates they would face and how they would also be able to repatriate funds. There's an exemption for startups there from contributions to the Industrial Training Fund, so where they provide in-house training to their employees for the period, it grants them the level of the exemption from the ITF. Now, if you've looked closely at some laws, I mean, it was quite interesting for us because it then made us scope quite a number of existing laws under the Export Incentives and Miscellaneous Provisions Act. You know, there are some incentives that are there. There's an Export Development Fund, Export Expansion Grant, and Export Adjustment Scheme Fund. Now, these funds are available to companies that export products. And what people fail to understand sometimes is that when you're dealing in the digital space, you actually export services digitally, of course, but you know, if you're working out, if your client base is outside Nigeria, you tend to export, you know, those services. And even for startups that would be dealing with hardware or software that require exportation as well, there's actually a fund that is available, you know, for basically exports. And so what the Act then does as well is that label startups that are, you know, involved in exportation of products and services are entitled to those different funds that I itemized. We're also aware that the Central Bank of Nigeria, Bank of Industry, and a few other agencies of government have grants and loans that are provided. Now, what we then did is that the Secretariat, you know, will sort of have a process whereby label startups would have access to these grants and loans. There's also provisions for credit guarantee scheme. In terms of dealing with the regulators as well, you know, I'd referenced that earlier on, but it's also there. So collaborating with the Corporate Affairs Commission, for instance, some of us are familiar with how there can be challenges around a few things, you know, dealing with them. There's a fast track process for fintechs trying to get licenses from the SEC or the CBN. Again, we're familiar with some of the challenges that they face. A fast track process is also provided there. Those trying to get crowdfunding licenses, there's a process there for them. We're aware that the CBN, the SEC, and even other regulators may eventually come up with regulatory sandboxes. The Act also makes provisions for label startups that qualify to also be admitted into such processes. For intellectual property, there are provisions there to even assist startups to file international patents and trademarks. You know, so the Secretariat will also work with them. If you're dealing with NOTAP and you're trying to transfer or import foreign technology, again, there will be a process whereby you will be entitled to assistance to enable you facilitate and fast track that whole process of transfer of foreign technology. Now, for startups that are labeled and intend to exit through any of the exchanges, I mean, it could be NGX, it could be FMDQ, it could even be commodities exchanges. You know, we sort of kept that open, you know, by saying similar stock and commodity exchanges. The Secretariat and the government, if you will, you know, can assist you in exiting through through any of the exchanges by working with those exchanges to ensure that whatever assistance is required, you know, to fast track your process and to also make it easier for you, would also apply to the label startup. So these are just, you know, some of them that apply. There are quite a number, of course, but I'm sure that you would admit that these are well, quite substantial. In effect, of course, Oswald had mentioned a consultative forum. Now, that consultative forum is like an ecosystem space whereby label startups, investors, limited to impact investors, VCs, angels, PE funds that invest in startups, as well as ecosystem players like some of the associations, FinTech Association of Nigeria, and a few others, will form part of that consultative forum and can also have 4 of their members elected to the National Council. You know, so startups will also get the opportunity, labor startups will get the opportunity to lend their voices to the ecosystem activities and see how there can be that consistent and continuous change and improvement to what they can experience, not just for themselves, but even for the ecosystem as a whole.
Thank you so much, Davidson. Thank you so much. You know, I think what's clear is that there are numerous advantages, numerous benefits for labeled startups in the Nigeria Startup Act. And I think those advantages, those incentives are all clearly documented in Part 7 of the Act. Just to summarize, there are incentives around capital, especially through the seed fund that will be made available, funded with about 10 billion naira annually. There's a question already on that, which I would pose to Oswald shortly. There are incentives around regulation, mainly around the fast track process, because when you have a lot of government agencies working together, they're supposed to catalyze growth. They're supposed to expedite the processing of a number of regulatory approvals. There are incentives around fiscal incentives, tax incentives, ITF exemption, some form of investment tax credit for investors and things like that. So there are a number of incentives that way, pioneer status incentive for qualifying companies. And then there are things around talent, just ensuring that there are hubs that are available to develop talents. There's collaboration within the tech ecosystem so that people are not reinventing the wheel, and players in the ecosystem can leverage the capabilities and the capacity that exists within the system. So thank you so much, Davidson, for that. So I will come to Oswald now. There's a question in the Q&A box around implementation. And I know you already touched on that, but if you could just maybe speak a bit more. I think some of the members of the audience are looking to start taking advantage of the incentives from tomorrow, or maybe even today, and they are wondering, what are the timelines for the implementation of these things? The secretariat, when will it be set up? The portal, when will it be available for use? So also, I know you had mentioned that it's a journey. You've talked about the fact that there needs to be a demand for implementation, but if you could just maybe give an indication, or maybe just assuage people's curiosity, about the certainty of implementation and what they can look forward to seeing in the coming months. Over to you.
So that's a fantastic question, and I appreciate where that's coming from. I personally got phone calls the very next day after. Can you guys hear me?
I can hear yours.
Okay, so he's the one that's frozen. All right, so no problem. Yeah. Okay. So I got got phone calls personally the very next day after the act was signed. The act was signed on October 19th. I had phone calls the 20th asking when would this be implemented, or when can we access the incentives and packages within the benefits within the act. So I would say that the Nigerian Startup Act team is aggressively putting together an implementation plan that we believe would not just give us the ability to implement every single provision of this act, but more so ensuring that it's done with sustainability and continuity in mind, taking note of the fact that we're basically a few months away from a change of government. And one of the key things I've said in the past about this is that we have the government that stays, and then we have the government that goes. Some critical people in the development of this act are very much well in part of the government that goes. And it's critical that we embed this act within the government that stays, as from an implementation perspective, as well as balance it out with the same way the act was developed with the Big Tent approach, where we had private sector and public sector participators engaged, collaborating to develop the provisions of this act. It's the same way we want to implement the act. And one of the key things to the success of why we were able to do this act in such a quick, fast pace is very much from the support from, the ecosystem. So that's why it's critical that that support does not wane, right? So we want, people who, if you are eager to gain the benefits from the act, what you can do if you're not involved directly in the project is to continue to discuss the act, to continue to on your different platforms, talk about the act and give it, the attention that that you believe that is that is equal to the benefits that you believe you'll get from it. And that's just a small way to be able to participate in the process to help expedite it, because there's such a thing as political will that also helps expedite things like this. So it's critical that the citizens and the benefactors of the act take it personal and take a personal hold of the entire act in the first place, and in the second place, get very cozy with certain provisions that you do like, and have further discussions on how you believe those provisions can be better implemented. Those things, they bubble up. We end up hearing these things because we're going to end up doing engagement sessions and the like. And your thoughts and some of the things that you think will be done better or properly would ultimately, bubble up into how it's deployed. One of the things I also say is that most people don't understand that at least 99% of this act, although we started by saying there's a lot of provisions, 99% of the provisions in the act were gathered from engagement, from town halls and from a number of different engagements over different mediums, and it was all gathered by members of the ecosystem. And when I say ecosystem, I do mean the practitioner side of the ecosystem, and the policymaker side of the ecosystem just trimmed off what couldn't be done or what wasn't a federal jurisdiction to make sure that that the end of day document was something that would pass through the entire process and bring us to where we are today. Implementation is critical. I'm not going to throw data out here, although I'm very tempted to see how aggressive we're trying to do the implementation. But I think all you need to look at to understand the capacity of the team behind this, which, by the way, are about 90% volunteers, is that we're being told that we've done one of the fastest acts to go through the process. And we'll try to do the exact same thing in implementation. But what is critical is planning. What is critical is engagement. What is critical is continued support from you.
Okay, thank you very much, Oswald. We will definitely support you and the tech ecosystem in implementing the act. And I'm sure members of the audience that are eager to take advantage of the benefits of the act would also be committed to providing that support and also demanding the implementation to ensure that there is a full implementation and a speedy implementation of the act. Let me come back to you, Davidson, and now I'll be talking about some of the advantages that Nigeria as a country stands to gain. We've talked about the tech ecosystem gaining. Do you think that the country stands to benefit significantly from these from the enactment of this act, and in what specific ways do you see that happening? For instance, do you see tech dollars replacing our dependence on petrodollars in the short to medium term, or do you think this is a long-term play, maybe 10 years from now or so? So if you could comment on this from where you stand, advising companies, what do you happening?
Yeah, thanks, Akinwale. So, I mean, we've been in the tech space for a while, right? Like even you and I on the advisory side. So we've seen how Nigeria has increasingly had a very vibrant tech ecosystem. We've seen the number of unicorns that have come out of Nigeria, and being a unicorn or being a successful startup is not just limited to that business alone. Think of the people that are employed under that process. Think of the GDP that Nigeria earns as a result of that money coming in. For instance, some stats now, last year, at least the statistics that are available show that Nigerian startups retained over $1 billion, right? So that in itself coming into Nigeria, shows up the dollars that you're talking about now. We're not having startup dollars. Now, again, you see, because there's been a lot of failure rates of startups. We know that, there are a lot of numbers that are thrown out there, but a lot of startups tend to fail. Why do they fail? government policies, regulatory bottlenecks, dearth of talent, people just leaving Nigeria, the high cost of doing business, funding challenges. These are issues that can make, even think of your most successful business to just dry up and lose out. Now, what the Startup Act would seek to do is to close up some of these gaps, the regulatory bottlenecks that would stifle your business. The government is trying to, this act is looking for those solutions that would reduce those bottlenecks. The dearth of talent, with the startups enjoying those incentives, it will then mean that they can make more profit and then can pay their talents better and retain them. The high cost of business, the high cost of doing business could also drop when you have those talent and innovation parks. You have those technology free trade zones where there can be exports and even of equipment and facilities that most of these guys need. The funding challenges can be closed, by reason of the seed investment fund. Now, Tunisia is an example. Oswald had referenced them, right? They're one of the success stories, one of the first African countries to have their Startup Act. And some of the things that are under the act are sort of modeled after the Tunisia Act. Now, when Tunisia's Act was launched in 2018, 2019, they recorded almost $23 million from investors, from the investments that were made into the labeled startups. They were able to generate revenue of close to $23 million. And these were just about 16 startups that were labeled. So from those 16 startups, you were then able to generate revenue of $23 million. Now think of the number of startups we have in Nigeria. We're definitely going to have more than 16 labeled. Now, if they are labeled, granted those incentives with a good tracking and monitoring and evaluation process, in 1 year, we can only imagine how much revenue will be generated from them. It will definitely be more than 23 million, right? Which Tunisia generated, from within the first year of implementing their Startup Act. So that has a ripple effect across the economy, so to speak. We're the largest economy in Africa. We have a large percentage of, youths, folks that are under 35 years old doing amazing things. So imagine how that opens up so much within the space. So those are the kind of things that we're looking at this act being able to do. It will definitely, of course, based off proper implementation, it will definitely lead to a sharing up of our GDP and the tech dollars that you're looking out for.
Okay, thanks a lot, Davidson. Thank you very much. If I heard you correctly, you are confident or optimistic that there would be investment flows into Nigeria, foreign direct investment into Nigerian tech companies, that there would be increased profitability of tech companies in Nigeria. Increased profits would mean that they would pay companies income tax. That's if they are not eligible for pioneer status during their startup period of 10 years. Otherwise, they would enjoy pioneer status. But then even if they enjoy a tax holiday, they would come out of it eventually. And then the profits they are generating would result in tax revenue for Nigeria. The employees would be well paid, like you mentioned, so that they don't currently procure. They are sourced offshore. If those are now locally produced, then that means they can be sold probably in Naira. It will result in reduced cost of operations for other companies in even other industries, which means their profits will go up, their taxes would go up. So one can only imagine what the spiral effect of a good implementation of the Nigeria Startup Act would mean for the Nigerian economy. Okay, I would come back to Oswald now. There are some questions that have been asked. So I would quickly ask the question before we take a break. We'll take a brief break at 11 to do some survey. So there's a question, Oswald, that the act is silent on the sources of the financing of the Startup Investment Seed Fund, given the issue of multiple taxes that Nigerian businesses have had to grapple with, and the need to enhance the ease of doing business in the country. The person said, I hope that there will not be additional levy on businesses. Is the government thinking of financing the fund from the 1% currently being paid to the NITDA annually? So, Oswald, how would the investment seed fund be funded?
So this is an interesting question, and I don't think I don't have enough time to elaborate on how interesting this question and how far back it's gone, as it was a crucial point of discussion during the development of the act itself at different levels. What I would say is that no, we do not intend to further task businesses with this fund. I believe what the act actually says is that council would decide. And the reason why we've done it that way is that we believe there'll be multiple sources of funding that will be made available to this fund. We ultimately believe this will end up being a fund of funds in the end, in the long view, where the NSIA will be managing funds over time and actually, getting other venture capitalist companies to take on the investment from this fund source. What we believe is that, we've already been approached on this. There's several other entities that want to put money into this fund. The government itself of Nigeria is going to invest in this fund, as the document also says, into this fund. But will not be levying companies or mature entities to fund this fund.
Oh, okay. I think that's
so. Let me just add to that. It is not silent. What is not doing is not tying us down to one particular source, right? So what was the option of this was to say specifically it's going to come from Davidson, Davidson Slush Fund. We didn't want to tie it down because the way the conversation has been going is that there are going to be several sources, and this fund, although we say 10 billion, we suspect that it's going to annually. We suspect it's going to be a very large fund in a short period of time.
Okay, great. So
yeah,
what you described.
Can I say?
Go ahead, Davidson. Go ahead.
Yeah, just to lay out on what Oswald said concerning the NITDA fund. So we had several conversations. We did look at a couple of funds, even the ITF, fund. There is a fund that the Nigeria Communications Commission also has. We looked at most of those funds, and because those funds are set up for their purposes, the statute that sets them up provides their purpose. You can't start trying to seed the investment seed fund from those funds. The NITDA fund, for instance, we had meetings with the DG of NITDA, with the head of legal at NITDA, to discuss on that fund. And what the act provides for it and how it's supposed to be used. It doesn't provide for these things that we want, the Startup Act to do. So trying to eat into those statutory funds will not be the solution. We also don't want to be taxing startups and other businesses to seed the fund, which is why the NSIA is responsible for managing that fund. And we did have engagement with the NSIA. The NSIA, they have about 3 funds that exist presently there. But then again, like Oswald said, we also didn't want to go too granular on some details, because when you do that, you then prevent other scenarios that can take place. The fund manager may decide to set up the rules for funding. They may decide to do funding rounds. They may decide to reach, so they will set out the rule books for that. If we start trying to go granular with the act on those provisions, we could hit the brick road and certain challenges. Let the work go on, subsequently with the rules that, the act allows these bodies to be able to issue. So those were our thinkings behind it. And we decided not to go the route of trying to share the existing funds, because it may just be dead on arrival.
Let me also add to that. Sorry, this topic, as you can tell, is a key one, right? Let me just add to that. One key thing people tend to miss, I think even the KPMG report actually mentioned this particular question. So that's why we're trying to hop on it perfectly, is that you also have to notice that the act says council to decide, right? And if you look at the council, you have a decent percentage of FEC sitting on the council, right? You have the Minister of Finance, you have the Minister of Trade and Investment, you have the President and the Vice President. Should I say more, right? So this is a strong portion of the leadership of the country sitting on this council specifically to address issues and provide directive for this sector. It's deliberate and it's intentional.
Okay, thanks a lot, Oswald and Davidson. So what's clear is that the Act isn't silent on the sources of funding. The Act is just flexible about it. The Act states that the details will be spelled out. And the optimism that I see from Oswald and Davidson is that maybe contributors to the funds will be falling over themselves to actually make funds available because they know what massive impact the growth of the tech ecosystem in Nigeria can do for the country, for the continent, and for the world. So that would be great. So at this point, we're going to take a poll. We're going to be asking some questions. So I'm going to turn these over. So Precious, if you could just launch the Slido. So what you would do is you would see Can we start that up? Okay, so you can see on your screen the Slido for the survey. So just go to slido.com on your phone, or you can, also snap this barcode to connect directly. But if you go to slido.com, you can put in the number 2185336. There are a number of questions that will be asked. We just want to, feel your pulse, be sure that you are following, and also get some responses from you, questions, answers from you regarding the discussion that we're having. We're trying to ensure that this conversation is as engaging as possible, and that the questions that you'd really want answered will be posed to Oswald and Davidson during the remaining 1 hour that we have left. So we'll just give you a minute. So if you could just go ahead and log on to slido.com and put in the number 2185336, or you can scan the barcode with your phone and connect to the survey. Okay, we've also dropped the link to the page in the chat group. So you can also click on the link in the chat box. You can click on the link in the chat box. That will take you directly to the page, and then you can connect. Just log in, put in your name, and then we can start. So we're waiting for people to join. And you can start answering the questions. The first question we are asking is, do you think the enactment of the Nigeria Startup Act 2022 is a good development that would have a significant positive impact on Nigeria? So far, the response is a definite yes, 100%. Everybody is a believer. Everybody is optimistic about the potential of this piece of legislation. So let's see if there will be other views. Okay, some concern being expressed. 97% think it's a definitely yes. 3% of the audience think it's a no. We'll still stay on this question. Please join the poll, make your voice heard. Let's know your view about what you think about the act. Do you think it would have a significant positive impact on Nigeria? Will it help us grow the economy? Will it have an impact on employment? Will it result in revenues for the government? Nigeria is currently in a dire state revenue-wise. So we need to to be sure that the pieces of legislation coming in would move the needle, would make an impact. Okay. I think many people think that it would have a positive. So I think Oswald and Davidson, you've done a great job trying to sell this idea to people. I think a lot of people believe that there will be a positive impact on the country, and I think that's good. And so what's left is for people to actually demand that there be an implementation, and an expedited implementation at that, of this piece of legislation to actually realize its potential over the course of the coming months and years. Okay, so we'll say 95% and 5%. Okay, so the second question is, do you think the Startup Act would incentivize increased foreign direct investment into Nigeria? Do you think the Startup Act would incentivize increased foreign direct investment into Nigeria? We've talked about startup dollars, about tech dollars. Foreign direct investment has been on the decline over the last couple of years. Will this piece of legislation help reverse that trend? Will it result in more unicorns being created? Would it result in foreign investors pouring in billions of dollars into innovative companies in Nigeria that can transform the digital technology ecosystem in Nigeria, in Africa, and globally? Okay, the response is positive, but not as positive as the first one. So 72% of our audience currently believe that the enactment of the Startup Act would result in increased foreign direct investment. 27% don't think so. Okay, more responses are still coming in. So if you are yet to log in, please log in, join the poll. Let's hear from you. Let's know your views. Okay, the percentage of those answering in the affirmative is reducing gradually. 71% still think, though, that the act would result in increased foreign direct investment. Okay, let's move to the next question. Okay, so this question is open-ended. What issues do you think plague the tech startup ecosystem that should have been covered by the act, or that should be prioritized in implementing the act? Oswald and Davidson have talked about all stakeholders getting involved, about the pull factor, about stakeholders making a demand on government to ensure that this act is implemented. So what are the issues that you'd have loved addressed that you didn't see addressed in the act? Or what are the issues that you think should be prioritized during the implementation phase of the act? So let's get responses from you. You can just type in your responses and post them. Okay, safety of investors' funds. Safety of investors' funds, very key. Someone says it's a cowboy ecosystem. Smoke pollution. So maybe concerns around ESG there. Okay. Corporate governance, very important. Accessibility may be an issue. Other social infrastructure that can aid the growth of these businesses. Non-digital business solutions, unavailability of social amenities, provision of enabling environment. Okay, it's restriction to just one sector. Integrity on the part of startup players. Funding is addressed. Funding is addressed in the act. Security of investors' funds, continuity of the policy. Well, it's a legislation, so I think that gives more certainty. It can only be amended by the legislature. Specific timelines for the implementation. I think Oswald had touched on that, and all of us need to contribute in demanding that implementation. Corporate social responsibility, loan accessibility. There is funding available under the Startup Investment under the startup seed fund. So I think that should address issue of funding, corruption in approval process. Okay, so let me just give you a few minutes, Oswald and Davidson, if you just want to comment on any of these points that have been mentioned by our audience. These are the concerns that people have, these are the areas that people think should be considered or should have been considered or should be prioritized in implementing. Do you have any comments on these points that have been made? Oswald, maybe you can go first.
Yes, I would say this. I would say one of the things we need to understand is that, the Act actually paints a picture, and you have to try to look at it from that perspective. Don't look at it in any singular provisions. Look at the provisions together, how they work together for the good of the entire document, right? The security of investor funds. You start looking at the reason why that's the case and what is being done to incentivize investor funds. What's being done to, so for instance, if you invest in the labeled startup, one of the key things is we know that company, and you know that you invested in that company through the process, right? Through the Act itself. So there's some assurances as to who the company is and ultimately, what they're doing, because that's all sort of validated. So it's a pre-DD. The Act itself the Act process is actually doing a pre-DD for you. So there's a number of things in the Act that plant seeds, right? And in these seeds, if they're in the implementation of these provisions, there's going to be a lot of value created to answer a number of these things that have been listed. And it's still in front of me, so I can't. It's almost like I'm trying to read it as I'm talking. So, for instance, accessibility to loan facilities. There's a credit scheme in the Act. This one, the applicability of laws in states or how states can make acts. I don't know what the person is saying here. But ultimately, a number of these things are covered. I think somebody earlier said cowboy, which is also very interesting. Somebody may be looking for $500,000 and they will end up registering in Delaware for that $500,000. But when they sign 2 or 3 documents, they don't realize that there are dozens of laws and dozens of provisions that guide those documents they've just signed, right? The process may now be easy because the process is mature. You're probably doing it online, or a lawyer sends you one thing, you click on it, and you're now, boom, a Delaware company. But there are dozens and dozens of provisions and dozens of policies and regulations that are attached to that one action. So that is what we're trying to do here, in the sense that we need to create that environment that supports a number of things that makes the environment, investable, right? So for instance, IP, right? If your intellectual property is not strong, it becomes a problem. So the Act actually takes a conscious effort in ensuring that we plant seeds and we invest our time in ensuring that our IP and our trademarks regimes work appropriately to guarantee investment.
Okay, thanks a lot. Thanks a lot, Oswald. Davidson, you want to chime in on this?
Yeah, sure. Maybe I'll touch on corporate governance, right? Again, the Act is not trying to solve corporate governance issues for startups because there are already sufficient laws that deal with that. But here's what the Act actually does. And if you look at Section 16, it does place obligations on labeled startups. First one is that they have to comply with all the extant laws, in Nigeria that govern businesses. Now, they also have the obligation to provide on an annual basis, information to the Secretariat on the number of employees they have, the total assets they have, annual turnover as well. And it has to track from the period that the labeling, was given to them. They're supposed to maintain proper book of accounts. They will provide an annual report on incentives they received and how they, use them. Where there's any change in their structure or composition, then they're supposed to notify the Secretariat. And then the Secretariat, through the coordinator, will also place certain obligations on them, which could cover corporate governance, of course, regulatory compliance issues, but there'll be further obligations that will be placed on them by the rules that they have to comply with. Now, where they default in any of the obligations under Section 16, then the Secretariat will withdraw the label from them where they fail to rectify that within 30 days. So I think you can see a level of responsibility. and then obligations placed on the label startup. So it's not that once you get labeled, then you just go to town and do whatever you want. You still have, the obligations that rest upon you. So I think that's what we could do. In terms of trying to present other layers of corporate governance in the Startup Act, I don't know whether this would have been the right legislation to do. We're talking about 48 sections, so sections on corporate governance would, just expand all that. I see a question on restricted to digital startups. I mean, it's tech-enabled startups, right? Folks should know that there is a SMEDAN Act, Small and Medium Enterprise Development Agency, Act of Nigeria. So already there is that government agency that exists that deals with your SMEs, that deals with your regular startups that are not tech-enabled. Now, we've seen how far that has taken us. And Oswald did say something around what this sector is doing, globally and also in Nigeria. So it's important that for tech-enabled businesses, and if you look at the Nigerian market, the business landscape, comparing SMEs and startups, you would admit that the startups face more challenges than the SMEs. For instance, those in the blockchain, cryptocurrency space are consistently been hounded and haunted. You've seen what has happened with the likes of RiseVest and Cowrywise and some of these other guys that deal with foreign share dealings, those fintechs, how the CBN freezes their accounts. You had GoCada that was trying to, create tech-enabled bikes and all of that. They got scrapped in Lagos State. You consistently see how the CBN and the SEC are hounding, these tech guys. That comes, so you have these things, they affect the tech-enabled startups. The SMEs deal with the normal business climate. So what affects your typical businesses would affect those type of startups. So the question is, what problem will the Act solve if we are expanding it to attend to all forms of small businesses in Nigeria? You always have to ask yourself when you're drafting a law, what mischief are you trying to solve? If the mischief either doesn't exist or it's beyond the scope of what you can cover, then why even delved into that at all? There's a question here that there should be a conscious effort to address the issue of spread versus meaningful impact. There is no need disbursing 10 billion to 100,000 who wouldn't be able to do anything. Okay, so let me say something about the entire labeling process and the intention for the fund. If you read the Act, it sets out the criteria for the label startups, right? So when you come under that labeling process, you would have met that criteria. Now, after you've also met that criteria, yes, there's no point in spreading it across businesses, but for you to even qualify, you must be solving a real problem. If you've ever, sort of had any pitches from the startups, they will typically take you through what they intend to do, what's the problem, what are the competitors, what's the market, how are they going to solve this, what kind of revenue, so most of those things that are going to happen, it will be the startups with the right metrics, for growth that will be looked at, not somebody who is just, trying to replicate already the existing issues that have already been solved long ago and would not take us anywhere. So that sort of sieving process will be done even for you to come into the labeling process in itself. And I believe that once that is done in the first place, any startup that is receiving the funding will definitely, be qualified enough to enjoy, the incentives for growth. Now, how the fund manager would address, most of these issues is not something that I'll be able to speak to, but definitely for any startup that is labeled, the intention is for them to go through almost what could be akin to an incubation process, so that when they come out, they're minted, and can effectively compete against startups all over the world.
Okay, thanks a lot, Oswald.
Let me just add. Let me add to that, and this comes from the participation aspect of what I discussed earlier. I mean, there are questions, and there are questions that we have to almost ask: are you listening to what we're saying, right? I don't want to come off like I'm scolding, but I think it's critical that we understand that we need to embrace the document, what we have now, right? Like I tell Davidson, I said, Davidson, I already have a document in my machine called Amendments to the Nigeria Startup Act, right? And we're still working on implementation. I'm in my backhand working on something called amendments. And every time I see something in the act, where I go, based on that conversation I just had today, maybe we can make some changes. I go there and I type something, right? Not to say I'm going to be involved in amendments to Nigeria Startup Act. In fact, a KPI for me is that I'm not involved. That is somebody else that's doing it. And I'm sitting outside watching and going, wow, they're doing a fantastic job and they're doing better than we did, right? That's sort of a KPI for me personally. But, it's for us at this point to embrace the document, right? Listen to what's being said, embrace the document, and try to understand what's being said. So like, for instance, this question that's right in front of us, there's nothing in the document that says 10 billion will go to 100,000 startups, right? So even the way the question is being posed, nothing in the document says that. It actually says annually, the 10 billion, so you start misplacing things. The 10 billion is the limit that the government needs to invest every year in that startup, in that seed funding. So let's say, for instance, in year one, there's no investment made. 10 billion must be there. In year two, no investment made because no company met it. 10 billion must be there. In year three, there'll be 30 billion in there. That's what the 10 billion refers to, right? It does not say that we're going to every year spread out, come and stand on a queue and take money because it's no. And it's a commercial investment. The companies, like Davidson just said, that will be subject to or able to get this seed funding. First, it must be labeled, which has its own strong criteria, and the business plan that they have must make sense, right? So ultimately, we need to read the document with some grace, and really form opinions based on what's on the document, what's being said, so that we're able to grow, advance our thoughts on it to figure out how we best implement it.
Okay. Thanks, Oswald and Davidson. Now, I think your comments are apt. Many of the comments here, I think they've been addressed already, and some of them are addressed in one way or the other in the Act. Regarding the issue of the Act focusing on the digital ecosystem, the digital technology ecosystem or tech-enabled companies. Now, I would say, like Oswald had said earlier on, other sectors of the economy are also beginning to come together to co-create their own piece of legislation. If there's anything that the tech ecosystem has shown us, is that co-creation with the government, public-private partnership of some sort can work. So if there are industries that are not growing because of specific challenges, then I think the stakeholders in those industries can actually come together, engage with the government, set up their own advisory council of some sort, draft the bill, liaise with the relevant ministry or agency of government, get it across to the National Assembly, use their relationships to lobby members of the National Assembly, because at the end of the day, this is in the interest of Nigeria. This is in the interest of growth. So I think the power of co-creating, that's what has been highlighted by the enactment of this act, especially it's expedited enactment within 1 year of it going to the National Assembly, it being passed. That's like a record timing. We're aware of other bills like the petroleum industry bill and how long it took to get that out. So this is powerful, and this is something that other sectors of the economy should embrace and try and see how they can actually drive policy change or drive legislative changes that would favor their sectors and grow the economy. It's not just about some companies benefiting, it's about the economy, the Nigerian economy as a whole benefiting, and these having a ripple effect. And some comments about whether it should be funding or mentoring. I mean, why not both? The Act contains provisions that also would address capacity building, talent development, and all that. So it's not just about funding. It addresses different issues plaguing the tech ecosystem in Nigeria. And I think maybe the last comment I'll just make so that we can go to the next question is, it's very easy today to layer other businesses, other industries with tech enablement. So why can't you have an agri-tech company? Why can't you have a pharmaceutical company that is tech enabled? And just look at provisions of the Startup Act and ensure that that you fit in. I think that's what stakeholders also need to realize. The focus is on tech-enabled ecosystem, but if it means being ingenious about and being innovative about creating solutions in other industries that would leverage technology. That's really the kind of innovation that we're trying to do in the country, and bring it to the stage of commercialization. I think those would definitely be covered, and the council will definitely be willing to look at those kinds of initiatives. Okay, so we'll go to the next question. Which of the following incentives available to label startups make you most excited about investing in the tech ecosystem in Nigeria? So we've talked about a number of incentives in the act. So we're just trying to fill people's pulse. So which one? Looks like tax holiday is really key. Yeah, okay. Access to finance under the Startup Investment Seed Fund, exemption from Industrial Training Fund contribution, 30% investment tax credits to investors on gains derived from the disposal of the investment. So there are a number of incentives there. You know, which one are you most excited about? Which one will really move the needle? Which one will really drive the kind of investment we are looking to see in the tech ecosystem in Nigeria? Okay, so tax holiday. So I think it's important for people to realize that there's a piece of legislation in Nigeria that forms the legislative basis for the tax holiday. And the tax holiday is for an initial period of 3 years, and it is renewable for additional period of either 1 year twice or 2 years. So maximum of 5 years. And there are a number of fiscal incentives. So apart from not paying companies income tax or not paying companies income tax during that period, there are also other incentives such as the capital investment that is made in terms of in terms of property, plant, and equipment. For instance, those kinds of assets will be deemed to have been acquired on the day following the expiration of the tax holiday, so that those companies can then take advantage of the capital allowances relating to the assets that were purchased during the tax holiday period. So those are some of the incentives. The dividends paid to investors in a pioneer company, those dividends are not liable to withholding tax. That's another major incentive that would be available to companies, that's labeled startups that are eligible to enjoy the pioneer status incentive. It's important to know that it may not be all labeled startups that would enjoy pioneer status incentive. There's a list of companies that are eligible. There's a list of products and services that are eligible to enjoy pioneer status incentive, and some of them, of course, relate to tech-enabled products or services. Okay, so majority of people think it's pioneer status, the tax holiday. That's the major thing. So Oswald and maybe your team, you would really need to engage with the NIPC to ensure that maybe the process for processing pioneer status is simplified, and startups can really benefit from these, and that will catalyze their growth, that would catalyze investment into Nigeria, that would catalyze their profits, and eventually result in tax payment when they come out of the tax holiday. Okay, the last question, let's go to the last question. So this is just another open question, just to also ensure that we're engaging. What is the most important question you would like answered regarding the Nigeria Startup Act? We have a number of questions in the Q&A box, which we'll be moving to after now. But if there is any question, very important, okay, when will implementation start? I think Oswald has already answered that question. There's already an implementation team in place. And they are looking for support, they are looking for collaboration. So this is not just going to be driven by government, this is going to be driven by both the public and the private sectors, just like the act was created by the public and the private sector. So implementation would also be done through a synergistic approach. Implementation is effectively starting now, and those who want to support can definitely provide their support to the implementation team that is being created. Any other question? Okay, thanks a lot, Precious. Now I think we can move to the Q&A section and try and answer some of the questions there in the interest of time. We have just 30 minutes to go. So let me come to you, Davidson. So there's a question. It says, please, can you explain section 13.2a on companies that have registered for more than 10 years? So I think this person is talking about some of the criteria in the Nigeria Startup Act for eligibility to get a label, a startup label. So could you explain, that provision? There's a mention of 10 years. The company must not have been in existence for more than 10 years. Can you just maybe talk about that briefly, Davidson?
Yeah, sure. So if you look at the definition section, right, for the Startup Act, you will see where we define startups, right? So it's a company that has not been in existence for more than 10 years, and then sets out what the objectives would be, being creation, innovation, development of unique technology, and all of that. So those are the criteria to even be a startup in the first place. Now, for you to then be a labeled startup, that very first criteria now, for you to be a startup, it must be less than 10 years, has to come into play here. And we can't leave it to chance, because again, if this provision wasn't here, we could then run into that problem. So that's why, other than defining, what a startup is, we then came to the labeling provision and said that the first criteria for you to be labeled is that you wouldn't have been in existence for a period of more than 10 years. So that's like a leveler. Basically.
Okay.
So if you're more than 10 years, then under this act, you would not qualify. Okay.
Thanks a lot. So the focus is on startups, really, not on mature companies, not on companies that have been in existence for decades. It's on startups.
Not on scale-ups, and people who have more or less moved past, some of the challenges that your typical startup will be facing.
Okay. So let me come to you, Oswald. There's a question here. What's the mechanism in place to ensure that there are no conflicts between the council agent, which is charged with the carrying out its general or specific directions, and the secretariat to ensure effective implementation of the act? So what mechanism is in place to ensure that there is no conflict between the council agent and the secretariat?
So I always wanted to say, I hope there is conflict between the council agent and the secretariat, as opposed to collusion between the agent and the secretariat. I think this may be, when we were speaking earlier, I thought that we probably had missed out drawing out the sort of the operational model of how the council, the secretariat, the consultative forum, and the council agent and the portal work together. Maybe if you picture with me, you have a council that has Mr. President on it with an 8-to-6 breakup of public sector being 8 and private sector being 6 on the council. You have the secretariat that manages the day-to-day, and what the secretariat does is well defined in the act. What the council does is well defined in the act. You have the secretariat that runs the business of the council, engages all the other external entities as the MDAs to deliver on the mandates of the council. You have the consultative forum, which Davidson elaborated on earlier, which is made up of labeled startups, funders, and other entities. And that forum is meant to represent the private sector. And from this consultative forum, do you get the 6? Actually, no, do you get 4 of the people from the private sector that sits on the council? So there should be a continuous interaction between the consultative forum and the secretariat on a day-to-day basis and on a week-to-week basis based on what the issues are. And those two bodies will together form the agenda for the council. So that's what they do. Now, below that, you have the portal, where is the automation of this interaction, right? A big part of the discussion and the co-creation of policies, which is actually mandated in the Act, in the sense that all policies and regulations are to be reviewed by the council. So co-creation of the Act, co-creation of policies and regulations will go through the portal. Access of services by labeled startups will go through the portals to a number of MDAs, so they'll all be present. Even third-party activities like, KPMG wants to invest in 10 health techs, that are labeled because they want them to have the benefits of the act, will go through this portal, right? And KPMG will be registered there, and they will now look to see who are the labeled startups and contact them through the portal. So you have that kind of going, and it's sort of self-driving in the sense that the Consultative Forum has interest in ensuring the Secretariat does what it's supposed to do, and the agenda is set for the council. Now, in addition, when you start thinking about monitoring and evaluation, you have to immediately think of the council agent. The council agent reports directly to the council, and it is also taking the mandates of the council and ensuring that from a monitoring and evaluation perspective, that the mandates of the council are being met. So there were several questions earlier about, and this one I wanted to mention it, right? Because there were several questions about what about this, what about that? David and I interestingly sat on the panel with people in Tanzania who were interested in doing the Startup Act as well, and they were talking to us about our process and our experience. And one of the questions that came up, and interestingly enough, across Africa, this is one of the key questions you hear a lot of times because people are interested in understanding how they can move from where they're at to come start the startups in Nigeria, because like I said, we're the largest market. So the question of entrepreneurial visa came up, and we gave them this example. We said, look, you have, a run through of the process, right? So you have the immigration visa as entrepreneurship visa as an issue. It will become an issue within the Consultative Forum. They will discuss it, and they will table it as something that needs to be addressed. It will now be discussed with the Secretariat, as this is an issue they want to address, and the MDA that is involved will also be brought into the picture, and potentially a policy will be co-created on how to manage entrepreneurial immigration. That is the mandate of the Act, that must happen for this particular sector, right? So what will not happen is that once that is done, that co-created policy will now go up to the council to be deliberated on and a directive given on what should happen. And once that directive is given, then it goes back down to the Secretariat to now push to the MDA that's involved to now execute on it. Now, back to monitoring and evaluation. The council agent is also listening in on what was the mandate, and is now charged with making sure that it happens or happened. And if it doesn't happen, a report will be issued to the council saying, here are the last 10 mandates, and here's where we are on the status on what has been done on those mandates. We are 30% here, 20% here, and the question will also be on the agenda is why? Why are we not meeting our critical mandates that have been given from the executive? Because once again, I must remind you, Mr. President, Mr. Vice President, a number of key ministers, there's a good percentage of FEC sit on this council. So those directives are to be followed. And that's the position of the council agents. But I particularly don't want them, personally, and this is just me, just speaking. I don't really particularly want them not to have conflicts. I think for some systems to work properly, there needs to be some kind of friction to ensure that the wheels are turning. So this is a monitoring and evaluation, and there may be conflicts, just taking right from the question, but hopefully it's a good kind of conflict to help us progress.
Okay, thank you very much, Oswald. Thank you. I think that's very clear. It's deliberate that, at least in terms of monitoring and evaluation, there are issues that are being faced by stakeholders. They will be reported and they will be dealt with. I think that's very important to note. Another question, and I would pose this to you, Davidson. So the question says, how can investors utilize the investment tax credit of 30% of their investment in a labeled startup if the investor disposes of the investment after 2 years, since no tax will be payable? Would such investor be able to apply the credit against the taxes payable on other income sources? Also, how can an investor that invests through a non-incorporated entity benefit from the investment tax credit, since the Act only references Companies Income Tax Act? So Davidson, over to you. The provisions on investment tax credit in the Nigeria Startup Act, where the investor is not liable to companies income tax, maybe because the investment was disposed of after 2 years, or maybe because the investor is not a corporate entity. How can
so I missed most of what you said. I don't know whether it's my network or yours. Can you hear me? Wow.
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
I can hear you now, but I couldn't hear you for a large portion. So do you want to take that question again? It was, I don't know.
Okay, that's fine. So I would repeat the question. So the question is, how can investors utilize the investment tax credit? There's an investment tax credit of 30% of gains realized from the disposal of an investment, based on the provisions of the investment of the Nigeria Startup Act. If an investor disposes of that investment after 2 years and is therefore exempt from tax, or if the investor is not a corporate entity, how can that investor still benefit from the 30% investment tax credit? That's the question.
Okay, so I don't know whether the network issue is from my end. So let me just disable my camera for now. So, well, that's an interesting question. So what the Act does provide is that it sets out the different folks, right, that can enjoy the 30% venture capitalists, PE funds, accelerators, or the incubators. So let me find the question again. It says, will such person be able to apply the credit? So this question looks like there are two or three different things being asked in one. He said, maybe we'll take it. How can the investor utilize the investment tax credit of 30% on their investment if it disposes of the investment after 2 years, since not tax will be payable? I think that provision on the 2 years side, if I'm not mistaken, is on capital gains tax. So that provision says that capital gains tax will not be charged on gains that accrue from the disposal of assets, by an investor within a 2-year period. I think that's different from the investment tax credit of 30%. Than what the Act provides is that such credit will be applied on any gains or investments which are subject to taxes. So if an investor is invested in a labeled startup, right, what the Act is basically saying is that they have that entitlement to investment tax credit of 30% of their investment in that labeled startup. And they will then not be taxed on any gains or investments which are subject to tax that meet up with that 30% credit. The person then asks, will such investor be able to apply the credit against the taxes payable on other income sources? The answer that I'll give to that is no, because again, that section seems to be clear on where you can apply that tax credit, right? It says it shall be applied on any gains on investment which are subject to that tax, but also talks about 30% of the investment in the labeled startup. So that would say that it wouldn't apply in that instance. Then this person also says, how can an investor that invests through a non-incorporated entity benefit from the investment tax credit, since the Act only references companies' income tax? Well, I think the simple answer to that would be that it only applies to companies. And so private investors may not directly benefit from this provision because it's a company's income tax provision. And so would only apply to companies in that sense.
Yes, thanks a lot, Davidson. I think that's very helpful. The incentive is specific. It applies to companies' income tax. And so it is companies that are liable to companies' income tax that would be able to enjoy that benefit. I think maybe during the course of the implementation of the Act, there can be discussions around what would happen if an investor that is entitled to companies income tax credit ends up not being liable to companies income tax because the investment was disposed of after 2 years. I think there can be discussions around that, and whether maybe there will be a grandfathering of the incentive of the credit, or whether the credit can apply to other sources. So I think those are matters of detail. They will probably be discussed during the implementation of the Act. So let me pose a last question as we begin to wind down this session. I'll just pose a last question to you, Oswald. And I think the Startup Act, as you can see from the poll and all that, it's been praised for seeking to leverage existing ministries, departments, and agencies of government in carrying out certain responsibilities stipulated in the Act. But practically, there are questions on whether the MDAs would cooperate. Have they been carried along? Would they grant the fee waivers, tax breaks, and other incentives available under the Act? And I'm posing this question to you, Oswald, because you are the senior special assistant on digital transformation to the president, and the president sits on the council. The president is extremely powerful. How would you respond to these questions? Would the MDAs cooperate? Would they work together to ensure that the provisions of the Act are respected and implemented?
Simple answer to that is yes. And the reason why I say so is because the MDAs were carried along. I think, one of the things we have to understand is when we say big tent approach, I don't know if anybody's heard that yet on this call, I don't think we've mentioned it, is we basically pulled everybody into the tent, both public and private sector, into a room, and we discussed the issues, and then we discussed what the provisions that that have come about, and the provisions that made it into the Act are provisions that both the MDA and the sorry, hold on a second, sorry. Oh, both the MDAs and the private sectors agreed to, right? So for instance, there was a provision for income tax that at some point we realized it was a state issue. So it was pushed up to what we call the state adoption program, where states are going to actually run their own adoption of the Nigerian Startup Act by doing provisions that fit their own strategy in their states. So yes, the states were engaged, and also if you ever get a chance to look at the recordings or any of the readouts from the public hearing in the Senate, you will see that the number of MDAs that were invited to speak, pretty much went up there and said, they agree with what the Nigerian Startup is trying to achieve, and they would and they fully support it. So that's where we are. And then most of the things in the Act were done intentionally. The setting up a council with Mr. President, Mr. Vice President sitting on there was intentional. And if you look at a lot of councils, you will see that in government, you see that it's either the president or either the vice president. In this situation, we have both of them sitting on the council to deliberate on issues because we believe that this sector, like I've said several times, is the fastest growing sector in the world, and Nigeria has an opportunity to make a mark in it. And that's why this law, is very intentional about this sector. So the MDAs were brought along. The Act mandates a number of things from the MDAs. It mandates a number of things from the Secretariat. The question would be, would they obey the law? And I would like to say, yes, they will. Okay,
thanks a lot, Oswald. Thank you so much for your time today and for response. I think there are some other questions. So let me pose the last question to you, Davidson. So there's a question around youth unemployment. Our youth unemployment rate is currently astronomical, and the Startup Act tries to ameliorate this by providing incentives to startups to employ fresh graduates. However, many of the graduates may not have the right skill set to take advantage of those opportunities. So Davidson, do you think this is a valid concern, or does the Startup Act provide a mechanism for upskilling the manpower required by labeled startups in Nigeria? So over to you, Davidson.
Yeah, well, I don't know. It always seems like now that when I'm required to speak, there's always an issue with my network. Is your question, this is embarrassing.
I can hear you clearly, Davidson. So the question is, some of the people that would do the work, some of the people that will be employed in Nigeria, we have a massive youthful population in Nigeria. But the question is whether they have the right skill set. And some of those that have the right skill set are emigrating from the country. And so, okay, you can't hear me.
Let me take that question, and I think we'll end on that note, right?
Okay.
So I think it's one case where we need to read the act. There's a whole section on training. We identify the issue that we need to train, so that we can expand the pipeline of resources. Because a lot of times we think startups, what really starves them is money. Yes, money is critical, but we've come to realize, and we know this, that resources is also important. Well-trained resources can save you money. The Act actually has a whole section on training, tying into NUC to try to establish programs to ensure that we can train our youth better so they can have the skills. And so that is a big part of the Act. So that answers that part of the question. Now, there was something said in the earlier part of the question, which actually does not exist in the version of the Act. There's no need to say version of the Act, there's only one version in the Act, which is the incentive to hire, I think it was a tax incentive to hire fresh graduates, XYZ. That incentive was actually removed, and it's actually probably going to sit in a state-adopted act, because we believe those kind of incentives are more state-driven, right? Because you could add more strategy to it and more nuances to it for it to be very effective. But the idea of the entire act is to create an opportunity for us to create great ideas in Nigeria that will impact the world. So my own personal mantra, as being one of the people who's involved or actually the lead for the Nigerian Startup Act, what is that, the very next idea that impacts the world starts in a Nigerian village, right? And you have to think what policies will help that come to fruition. And that's the angle we really need to read the document from. So this question right that we're seeing right now, even goes into JAPA. JAPA has started a long time ago. Like a learned friend of mine said that the first JAPA that was happening was with JAPA to Lagos, right? So when you read my bio, you read that I was on board of Edo Innovation. We also do training in Edo State. When the people are trained, they leave for Lagos. That's also JAPA. That's the first JAPA. Now, when people in Lagos now leave for over the seas, that's another version of JAPA. But I now say that we shouldn't concern ourselves with JAPA. What we should focus ourselves on is training at a faster pace than the people are leaving, which means we need to focus on our universities and focus on other ways to train our vast number of youths. Digital means, all kinds of sort of ways to get these skill sets in their hands so that they have, they're very skilled, they're already very energetic, very, driven young people. It's about putting the skills in their hands. If they JAPA, that's fine. India, they had a lot of people JAPA, and now when you look at all the top technology firms in America, they're led by Indians. How do we think that happened? It's not spiritual. It's the JAPA, right? So JAPA is not the issue. The issue we should be focusing on is how do we enable our education system to provide the skill sets for our young people. And the Act touches on it. It starts certain aspects of it, but this is really an education question. But the Act takes an attempt from this particular sector to address NUC, address certain training things that we need to put together, programs. I think I don't want to start looking at the section, but it's in the Act, and there's a whole section where it talks about training, NUC, and research. So that is well addressed in the Act.
Okay, thank you very much, Oswald. Thank you very much. And so I think we'll begin to just conclude at this point. I will summarize and just say we've talked about a number of things today, and it's been great listening to both Davidson and Oswald talk about the focus of the legislation that we've discussed. This is a very deliberate act. This is a very intentional act. It focuses on tech-enabled digital ecosystem. And so if companies want to take advantage of it, they need to just take note of that and ensure that they qualify, they meet the criteria set out in the Act. We've talked about the distinction between startups generally and labeled startups. Labeled startups are entitled to a number of incentives, tax incentives, fiscal incentives. And, if you read the Act, we've also shared the link to KPMG's newsletter on the Act. If you read section 4 of the newsletter, and 5, those sections talk about some of the general incentives for startups, things around financing of startups. There's the Startup Investment Seed Fund that label startups can qualify for. We've talked about that during the course of this session. One of the key issues when it comes to commercialization is the issue of funding. You have a lot of innovation, you have a lot of ideation, but when it comes to funding, sometimes it's difficult to be profitable when you are taking loans at 25%, 26% interest rate per annum. And so if funding, the issue of funding is dealt with, that would also ease label startups' ability to actually commercialize, be profitable, and to make an impact. So it's not just about the number of label startups that exist, but the impact that they are making. So we've talked about that. We've talked about the protection of intellectual property rights. That's very important, so that there's no infringement on label startups' intellectual property. We've talked about transfer of foreign technologies, the NITDA and the NOTAP, very important in that part of the system. The National Office for Technology Acquisition and Promotion, has been saddled with the responsibility of prioritizing applications from labeled startups so that the process is shorter and relevant approvals are granted. And I think the good thing is also that the Nigeria Startup Act contains a provision that basically limits the withholding tax rate on payments that are due from label startups to foreign maybe tech service providers to 5% rather than the normal 10%. That's also an important incentive that is in the Nigeria Startup Act. There are provisions on listing of startups. I think Davidson touched on that. So whether it's working with the Nigeria Exchange Limited or FMDQ or any other commodity exchange, whatever exchange that is that label startups need to register in, they would be supported by this piece of legislation. There's the issue around repatriation of capital and profits. The central bank has been mandated in the Act to ensure that that's seamless, that's certain. There's the establishment of technology development zones. That's also a provision, which means that label startups, aside from the tax holiday that is only available for 5 years, label startups may actually enjoy tax-free profits for a lifetime if they are situated in a free trade zone. There's access to export facilities. Davidson already touched on that. Collaboration amongst regulatory authorities and startups. Oswald talked about that. Oswald has talked about the fact that the MDs were carried along. All of them are committed to making this legislation work. And stakeholders, especially in the private sector, just need to ensure that they demand the implementation of this piece of legislation. There are provisions on accelerator and incubation programs, to build capacity, to ensure mentorship. Those provisions are there. There are tax and fiscal incentives. We've touched on all those. And I think the takeaway is this. We have companies, global companies. And when you look at the top 10 global companies today, you'll find that most of them are in the United States of America and China. And it's because those countries have made a deliberate effort to grow tech startups in their countries. So you are talking about Apple, Microsoft, Amazon, Facebook, all those companies. It's not a coincidence that they are domiciled in those countries. It's because of the environment, the kind of environment that was created. And it's also because those companies have over time made demands on the system to ensure that the environment works. The challenge now is for Nigerian tech companies to rise up to the occasion, collaborate with the government to ensure that there is an implementation of these acts and that it actually drives the kind of results it's meant to drive. I won't be surprised if 10 years down the line, we're talking about Nigerian companies declaring profits running into tens of billions of dollars just because they were able to enjoy incentives and they were enabled by the Nigeria Startup Act. So it's been a pleasure anchoring this session, and I'm very grateful to you, Oswald and Davidson, for spending 2 hours of your very busy time and schedule with us. We really appreciate it, and I'm sure our audience appreciates it. Thank you very much. We're going to share the YouTube link to this recording on our YouTube channel, and so you can look out for that. And we'll also share it on our LinkedIn channel. It's been a great time talking to you all. Have a nice afternoon, and thank you very much. Look forward to working with you.
Thank you, Akinwale, and thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.
Very much. This was brilliant. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Tola Adeyemi. I'm Senior Partner of KPMG in Nigeria and Chairman of KPMG in West Africa. I'm delighted to invite you to our KPMG Africa Digital Summit happening on the 30th of November this year. The Digital Summit is an annual flagship event that brings together C-level executives, tech leaders, subject matter experts, regulators, and industry stakeholders for a day of keynote addresses, panel sessions, and candid conversations. At the summit, there will be discussions around the need to create innovative solutions at market speed while meeting customers' ever-changing needs and retaining their trust. Be part of this summit that will not only provide amazing insights, but will also provide excellent networking opportunities with global speakers and panelists. Join us in person from any of our hubs in Lagos, Nairobi, or Johannesburg. We look forward to hosting you.